He never spoke much, but when he did, people listened. Miami was loud. The kind of loud that never stopped. Cars roaring through neon-lit streets. Music spilling out of clubs. Men shouting over money, over power, over nothing. Everyone wanted to be heard. Everyone wanted to matter. But Tony Montana didn't care about being heard. He cared about being remembered. When he first arrived in the city, he had nothing except a past he didn't talk about and a future he refused to lose. No money, no connections, no respect. Just another face in a crowd of hungry men trying to survive. Most of them tried too hard. Tony didn't try at all. He observed. He stood in corners, silent, watching how deals were made, how lies were told, how fear moved through a room without anyone saying a word. He noticed the small things, who avoided eye contact, who talked too much, who needed approval. That's how you learned in this world, not by speaking, by understanding. At the refugee camp, men bragged about what they would become. Kings, bosses, legends. They spoke like the future was already theirs. Tony never joined those conversations. One night, a man laughed at him. "You don't talk much, how you scared?" Tony looked at him for a long moment. Calm, still. Then he said quietly, "No, I just don't waste words." The laughter stopped. Not because the line was loud, but because it wasn't. Tony got his first opportunity the same way he got everything else, by being exactly where he needed to be. A low-level job, small money, dangerous enough that others hesitated. Tony didn't hesitate. He accepted, not because he needed the money, because he needed the opening. The job was simple on paper. Nothing ever is. A deal went wrong before it even began. Tension filled the room like smoke. Hands moved toward weapons. Voices rose, each man trying to dominate the moment. Chaos was seconds away. Tony stood still. He didn't panic, didn't react. He waited, and when the first gun was raised, Tony moved first. 2 shots, clean, precise. Final silence followed, not the comfortable kind, the heavy kind, the kind that forces everyone to rethink what just happened. Tony lowered the gun slowly. No speech, no explanation, just control. That moment changed everything. Word spread, not loudly, not publicly, but in the shadows where it mattered. "There's a guy doesn't talk much, but he's dangerous." That was enough. Tony Montana didn't chase attention. It came to him. That's how Frank Lopez noticed him. Frank was the kind of man who understood power, not just how to use it, but how to recognize it in others. And Tony had something rare: stillness. In a world full of noise, stillness was power. Their first real conversation was short. Frank leaned back, studying him. "You're quiet?" Tony didn't react immediately. He let the silence sit, then said, "I speak when it matters." Frank smiled slightly, because that answer told him everything. Tony started working under Frank, but he never acted like he belonged beneath him. He followed orders, but he never felt owned. There's a difference. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into opportunity. Tony handled everything with precision, no mistakes, no excuses, no unnecessary risks. He wasn't reckless like the others. He was calculated, and that made him dangerous. But what truly set Tony apart wasn't his skill, it was his mindset. He didn't think like a soldier, he thought like a king. Late one night, after a successful deal, the crew celebrated. Loud music, drinks, laughter. Tony sat apart from them. Watching, Frank approached him. "You don't celebrate." Tony looked around the room. Then back at Frank. "This," he said quietly, "this is nothing." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Nothing." Tony leaned forward slightly. "This is small." That was the first time Tony revealed it. Not ambition, certainty. From that moment, Frank understood something important. Tony wasn't here to be part of the system. He was here to take it over. But even then, Tony didn't rush. He waited, watched, learned. Because real power isn't taken in a moment. It's built in silence. And Tony Montana was very, very good at silence. By the time people started noticing his rise, it was already too late. He had positioned himself perfectly. Trusted enough to be close. Feared enough to be respected. Underrated enough to be ignored. That combination. Deadly. One night, during a quiet meeting, Frank spoke about limits. About staying careful. About not attracting too much attention. Tony listened. Really listened. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. "Why stay small when you can take everything?" No one laughed. No one argued. Because deep down, they knew he meant it. And when a man like Tony Montana means something, it's not a dream, it's a plan. Power isn't given, it's taken. And Tony Montana had spent too long watching other men pretend they deserved it. The shift didn't happen overnight. From the outside, it looked gradual, just another man climbing the ladder, earning trust, gaining responsibility. But inside, everything was already decided. Tony wasn't climbing, he was positioning. Frank Lopez still believed he was in control, that Tony was useful, loyal, predictable. That was his biggest mistake. Tony had already studied him, his habits, his fears, his weaknesses. Frank liked comfort. Tony hated it. Frank avoided risk. Tony understood it. Frank thought he owned the game. Tony was already rewriting it. The setup was quiet, no big announcement, no visible tension, just a deal, another meeting, another routine exchange. But nothing about that night was routine. The room was different. Subtle, but different. The men standing guard weren't the same. Or maybe they were, just not loyal to the same person anymore. Frank walked in confident, relaxed, talking like he always did, like the future belonged to him. Tony stood across the room, silent, watching, waiting. When the moment came, it wasn't dramatic, no long speech, no shouting, just a shift, a realization. Frank looked around. Something felt wrong. The energy had changed. The room no longer responded to him. It responded to Tony. "Tony," Frank said slowly, "what is this?" Tony stepped forward, calm, controlled, the same way he always moved. "You had what I needed," Tony said. A pause. Then, "Now I don't need you." That was it. No anger, no hesitation, no second chances. Frank tried to talk, tried to negotiate, tried to remind Tony of loyalty, history, everything they had built. But Tony wasn't listening anymore, because to him, that chapter was already over. What happened next was fast, final, and completely expected. When it was done, the silence returned. But this time, it wasn't fear of the unknown. It was understanding. Tony Montana was no longer part of the system. He was the system. Power changes people, but not always in the way you expect. Tony didn't become louder, didn't become reckless, didn't become careless. He became sharper. The suits got better, the houses got bigger, the money became endless. But Tony, he stayed the same at his core, still quiet, still observant, still dangerous. People started calling him boss. Not because he asked them to, because they didn't have a better word. Meetings became quieter when he entered, not out of respect alone, but out of caution. Because when Tony spoke, it meant something was about to happen. One of his men once asked him, late at night after a tense deal, "How do you stay so calm all the time?" Tony didn't answer immediately. He looked out over the city lights, then said, "Because I already know what happens if I lose." That answer spread, not as a quote, as a warning, because it revealed something important. Tony wasn't playing to win, he was playing to avoid losing, and those are two very different mindsets. His empire grew fast, faster than anyone expected. Territories expanded. Money multiplied. Enemies increased. Because power attracts attention, and attention attracts problems. At first it was small things, delayed shipments, disrespect disguised as misunderstanding, deals that didn't go as planned. Tony didn't react immediately. He never did. He watched, tracked patterns, understood intentions, and then he responded, not emotionally, strategically. One crew disappeared overnight. Another lost everything in a single week. A third tried to challenge him publicly. They weren't heard from again. No announcements. No warnings. Just outcomes. That's what made Tony different. He didn't threaten. He demonstrated. And that was far more effective. But as his power grew, so did the distance between him and everyone else. Trust became rare. Conversations became shorter. Rooms felt colder when he was in them, because no one really knew what he was thinking. And that made him unpredictable. Even his closest allies started choosing their words carefully, not out of fear alone, but because one wrong sentence could shift everything. Late one night, standing in his mansion, looking over the city he now controlled, someone asked him a simple question. "Is it enough?" Tony didn't answer right away. He stared at the skyline, the lights, the empire, everything he had built from nothing. Then he said quietly, "There is no enough." And that was the truth. Because Tony Montana wasn't driven by need anymore. He was driven by identity. Power wasn't something he wanted. It was something he believed he was meant to have. All of it. But there's a problem with that kind of thinking. It doesn't stop. And when something doesn't stop, it eventually breaks. Tony just didn't see it yet, because from where he stood, at the top, everything still looked under control. And that's exactly when control starts slipping. Power has a cost. Tony Montana always knew that. He just believed he would be the exception. At the top, everything looks stable, controlled, untouchable. But that's an illusion. Because the higher you rise, the less room you have to fall. Tony Montana had everything now. Money that didn't need counting. Power that didn't need proving. A name that carried weight in every room it entered. But something had changed. Not around him. Inside him. The man who once spoke only when necessary started speaking more. At first it was subtle. Shorter patience. Sharper tone. Less silence between decisions. Then it grew. Tony began questioning everything. Every delay. Every look. Every word spoken around him. Trust, the one thing he never valued much, completely disappeared. His closest men noticed it first. They started choosing words carefully, avoiding eye contact, keeping distance. Because the problem with a man who trusts no one is that eventually no one stands with him. The empire was still strong, but the foundation cracking. Pressure came from all sides. Rival groups reorganizing, law enforcement closing in, deals becoming harder to control. Before, Tony handled pressure like a machine, cold, efficient, unshaken. Now, he reacted, and reaction leads to mistakes. It wasn't one big failure. That's not how empires fall. It was small things. A decision made too quickly, a warning ignored, a move based on emotion instead of calculation. Each one a crack, and cracks spread. One deal collapsed. Then another. Then another. Money slowed. Tension grew. Enemies sensed weakness. Because power doesn't disappear quietly. It gets challenged. And for the first time, Tony Montana wasn't fully in control of the challenge. The final night didn't feel special at first. That's how endings usually begin. Normal then. Everything changed. Gunfire erupted fast, loud, unrelenting. His mansion, the symbol of everything he had built, turned into a battlefield. Men shouted, ran, fell. Chaos returned. Just like the beginning. But this time, Tony wasn't rising through it. He was surrounded by it. Still, he didn't run. He stood in the center of it all. For a moment, everything slowed. The noise faded. The movement blurred. And Tony Montana remembered something. This was where he was strongest. Not in boardrooms, not in luxury, not in control, but in chaos. He picked up his weapon. Tight grip, steady breath. And for the first time in a long time, he smiled. Because the fear was gone. Not because he felt safe, but because he felt clear. This was simple. Win or lose. No strategy. No long-term plan. No empire to maintain. Just survival. And that he understood better than anyone. He moved forward, not back. Shots fired. Precise. Relentless. One enemy dropped. Then another. Then another. For a moment, it looked impossible. Like he might actually fight through it. Like the same force that built his empire might save it. But power doesn't make you invincible. It just delays the inevitable. More enemies came, from angles he couldn't control, from places he couldn't predict. Because this wasn't his game anymore. This was the consequence of it. Still, he didn't stop, didn't hesitate, didn't surrender. Because Tony Montana never believed in losing quietly. The final moments came fast. Too fast. A single opening. A single mistake. And everything changed. The shots hit. Time slowed again. The noise disappeared, the chaos faded, and for a brief second, there was silence. The same silence that followed him from the beginning. The same silence that made people fear him. The same silence that built everything he had. Now, it was all that remained. Tony fell, not as a boss, not as a king, but as what he always truly was, a man who refused limits. His empire didn't vanish instantly, but without him, it was already gone, because power like his doesn't transfer. It collapses, and the legend, it stayed, not in the money, not in the mansion, not in the territory, but in the story. The man who came from nothing, took everything, feared no one, and lost it all, the same way he lived, without backing down. In the end, he never became loud like the others. Even at his peak, even at his fall, he remained the same, a man of few words. But when he did speak, people listened, and when he was gone, they remembered.